Judge Thomas Whitaker's quiet summer morning is interrupted by a glossy envelope nailed to his cabin door, bearing the seal of a brand-new HOA. The sun was just rising behind the ridge, casting soft amber light across the trees. A breeze rustled through the pines, carrying the scent of dew and warmed bark. Thomas sat on his porch swing, a thick ceramic mug of black coffee in one hand, and the morning edition of the Pine Valley Gazette folded neatly on his lap. A faded baseball cap shaded his eyes. Somewhere inside the cabin, the old radio played a soft stream of classical piano, barely audible over the chirping birds. The wind chime, Ellen's favorite, clinked its familiar, uneven rhythm. He'd nearly missed the envelope. The bright sheen caught his eye only after he rose to stretch and wandered toward the door. It had been nailed into the center of the cedar frame with surprising precision, as if someone had taken their time to drive the tack just deep enough not to fall, but not enough to damage the door. As Thomas removed the envelope, a memory stirred, something from a decade ago, back in Monroe County, where a neighbor's fence dispute had turned into a zoning nightmare. But this was different. This was his home, his land, the last piece of Ellen he had left. He slid his thumb under the seal and opened it. Inside, printed on thick, glossy paper, was a welcome letter from something called the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. It congratulated him on being invited to join a newly established community initiative aimed at preserving the integrity, harmony, and value of Pine Valley properties. A list of membership benefits followed: trash removal coordination, decorative mailbox discounts, community beautification contests. Then the real terms: a one-time enrollment fee of $5,000 plus monthly dues of $275. Beneath that, a recommended compliance timeline, complete with suggested improvements to maintain visual cohesion. Thomas raised an eyebrow at the bullet points. Remove non-regulation exterior paint, e.g., non-neutral tones such as violet, sunset orange, or cottage blue. Update porch steps to HOA certified stone style. Replace overgrown vegetation with HOA-approved ornamental shrubs. He didn't have to look far to know what they were targeting. Ellen had painted the trim herself, lavender gray with a hint of rose. Almost thistle, she used to say with a smile. The stone steps, laid by hand with his father before him, were uneven but solid, and the garden, wild and sprawling, filled with columbine, poppies, and goldenrod, still bloomed around the porch. He refolded the letter carefully and placed it on the kitchen table. The mug in his hand was growing cold. Around mid-morning, as he sat whittling a cedar scrap by the porch rail, a sleek white SUV pulled into the gravel drive. He recognized the vehicle. Karen Delaney stepped out, phone in hand, white blouse crisp, sunglasses perched like a crown. "Morning, Judge Whitaker," she called too cheerfully. "I hope you received our welcome package." Thomas offered a small nod, setting the carving knife aside. "I did?" Karen approached the porch steps without waiting for invitation. "We're so thrilled to be organizing things up here. Whispering Pines is really the future of Pine Valley. And we want you with us. Your property is so prominent." She gestured to the garden, nose wrinkling slightly. "I mean, the natural charm is lovely. But don't you think it could use a little refinement?" Thomas said nothing. She continued, "Just a bit of sprucing up, clean lines, HOA-aligned coloring, maybe redoing the trim in a more neutral tone. Oh, and the stone path, such a tripping hazard for visitors. We'd be happy to recommend a contractor." He looked at her evenly. "Mrs. Delaney, this land has been in my family since 1927. My father built that porch. My wife planted that garden. I'm not interested in joining your association." Her smile faltered for a moment, then returned sharper. "Oh, I think there's a misunderstanding. Your property falls right inside the HOA expansion zone. We've already received majority signatures from neighboring parcels. With full activation, compliance is, well, it's not really optional." Thomas stood, brushing wood dust from his pants. "My deed predates any HOA authority in this area. I checked. The zoning boundaries haven't shifted. You may want to confirm with the county clerk." Karen tilted her head. "Progress always meets resistance at first, but it's happening whether we like it or not, and non-participation can lead to some complicated outcomes." She turned and descended the steps, heels clicking on the gravel. At the door of her SUV, she paused. "You have 48 hours to submit your enrollment form. After that, the board will proceed with preliminary assessments." He didn't answer. Just watched the SUV disappear into a swirl of dust. That evening, as the sun dipped low, casting gold over the pines, Thomas took a slow walk along the edge of his property. Near the south fence post, a bright pink flag caught his eye, thin plastic flapping in the wind. Another stood near the east corner, just beyond the garden. He hadn't placed them. The next morning, as he stepped onto the porch with his usual mug of coffee, another envelope waited, taped neatly to the door. Smaller this time, and marked with bold red text. "Notice of Preliminary Compliance Inspection. 72 hours." Thomas sips his coffee slower than usual, eyes narrowing at the marker flags. He walks to the shed and pulls out an old leather-bound county zoning binder. Returning from his morning coffee at Earl's Diner, Thomas finds his wife's wildflower garden replaced with sterile gravel, and an HOA sign staked in the center. The heat was already rising off the pavement as Thomas made his way back from Earl's. The diner had been buzzing with talk of the upcoming Pine Valley Summer Picnic, live music, lemon bars, and the annual pie contest. But beneath the cheerful chatter, Thomas had noticed something else. A tension like an itch behind the eyes. Earl had poured him a second cup of coffee without being asked, his usual small talk cut short. "They took down Ruth Langston's lattice fence," Earl said over the sound of the percolator. "Called it non-conforming, been there since 1982, and old Mr. Perez got fined for leaving his hose out. Trip hazard, they said." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess, HOA?" Earl gave a slow nod. "You're not the first they've gone after." Thomas left a $10 bill under his saucer, more than enough, and stepped into the sunlight. His boots crunched on the gravel path leading up to his cabin, the pine branches swaying gently overhead. But something was off. The air felt thinner. The birds had gone quiet. He reached the porch and froze. The garden was gone. Where Ellen's wildflowers had danced, her foxgloves and asters, the purple coneflowers she used to call brave blossoms, there was now a uniform layer of coarse gravel. Bark mulch ringed the base of the porch, and a fresh HOA sign stood staked like a claim. Corrective beautification, Phase 1, complete. A pink violation slip was taped to his door. Pest-attracting vegetation removed per Ordinance 2.6b, non-member property under supervised compliance. Appeal window, 10 business days. Thomas reached out slowly, peeling the notice from the wood. His fingers trembled, not with rage, but something quieter. He turned, scanned the perimeter, and that's when he saw her. Barbara Kinney, HOA secretary, stood near the road, snapping photos with a large lensed camera. She wore a visor and a T-shirt that read, "Compliance is kindness." Her mouth twisted in a polite smile. "Just documenting updates," she called out. Thomas stepped down from the porch. "On whose authority?" Barbara didn't answer, just took another photo and turned away. Inside, the cabin felt hollow. The scent of wildflowers had been replaced by chemical dust from the mulch. He stood at the window, eyes following the neat, sterile path where Ellen's blooms had once stretched freely. The space looked stripped, blank, as if the past had been erased with a rake. He picked up his phone, dialed the number listed on the pink slip. It rang once before going to voicemail. HOA office. No message box. Later that afternoon, he walked to the Delaney's place. Karen opened the door wearing a soft peach cardigan and a smile so sweet it might have passed for genuine, if he hadn't known better. "Judge Whitaker, I was just about to call you. How are the improvements looking?" "You destroyed my wife's garden," he said evenly. Karen blinked, then tilted her head. "Your file showed multiple unaddressed notices. Non-conforming vegetation can't go uncorrected during compliance week. It attracts ticks, you know." "I never received a second notice," Thomas said. Karen clucked her tongue. "Sometimes they get misfiled, but per our charter, silence is taken as consent. It's all standard procedure." She gestured behind her. "I can have our landscapers swing back and install HOA standard shrubs at a discount." Thomas stared at her for a long moment. "Don't." He turned without another word and headed home. That evening the light dimmed early. Clouds rolled over the hills like slow-moving guards. Thomas stepped onto the porch, camera in hand, and began documenting everything. He took wide shots of the garden area, close-ups of the sign, the gravel, the stakes. He pulled the violation notice into frame and snapped it, front and back. Inside, he opened a fresh folder in his filing cabinet, HOA Interference. The first printouts went in. By 9 p.m., the cabin was dark except for the glow of his desk lamp. He sat quietly, reviewing old property photos on his laptop, when a sharp metallic clink echoed from outside. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped into the yard. 2 figures in reflective vests stood near his shed, measuring tape pulled taut between them. They froze as his light hit them. "This is private property," Thomas said. One of the men shifted. "Just confirming easement parameters, HOA directive. You've been asked to leave." The taller one hesitated, then nudged the other. They packed up without a word and walked off into the dark. Thomas watched them go. Only when they'd vanished did he notice the faint scuff marks in the soil where Ellen's columbine used to bloom. The next morning the mail brought a certified envelope. Inside, notice of pending lion, non-compliance penalties, $2,450. Payment due, July 1st. Failure to remit may result in legal action. Thomas set the letter down with deliberate care. Then, without a word, he walked to the back room of the cabin, unlocked a drawer beneath an old cedar writing desk, and reached inside. From the shadows he pulled out a small, dusty flash drive, etched into its casing in faded marker. Evidence archive. Inside a courtroom, Thomas delivers closing remarks in a civil case about land encroachment, minutes before receiving the call that his own cabin has been destroyed. The ceiling fan above the courtroom spun slowly, barely stirring the stale air. Sunlight spilled through the tall windows, catching dust motes suspended in silence. Judge Thomas Whitaker sat behind the bench, hands folded, glasses resting low on his nose. "Land is more than soil," he said to the room of attorneys and rural landowners. "It's memory, it's effort, it's where we plant our future. And when someone edges over a boundary, not by accident, but by convenience, they trespass on more than a title. They trespass on trust." He let the words settle, then nodded toward the bailiff. "Ruling will be filed by end of week." As the room shifted with murmurs and the shuffle of papers, Thomas gathered his files with measured grace. Janine, his longtime clerk, hovered nearby, her brows pulled tight. "Sir," she started, holding a phone, her hand shaking slightly. You need to take this. It's urgent." Thomas's gaze sharpened. He took the phone. The voice on the other end was the Pine Valley Fire Chief. "Your property? It's gone, Judge." "Gone." He didn't respond right away. Just listened to the rest of the short, stilted sentences, thanked the chief, and handed the phone back to Janine without a word. The courthouse hallway felt too narrow as he walked out. His shoes struck the tile in deliberate rhythm. He didn't speak during the 20-minute drive, the winding road up the mountain familiar. But today, strange. Somewhere around the fourth bend, he saw it. A thin black column of smoke stretching into the sky like a wound. His breath caught. He pushed the gas. When he reached the turnoff to his land, the air was thick with the acrid scent of ash and splintered wood. Fire trucks were already gone. Yellow tape looped between fence posts. Charcoal and cinders covered the grass like snow. What remained of the cabin stood like the ribs of a broken ship, half of a frame, a few blackened beams, nothing more. The wind chime still hung by the porch, bent, blackened, the notes warped by heat. It tinkled softly in the breeze. He stepped carefully through the debris. The porch was a memory. The kitchen, gone. Where Ellen's rocker once sat was now a twisted fragment of metal. A woman's voice broke the silence. "Oh, Judge Whitaker, I'm so sorry," Karen Delaney called from her SUV, parked with perfect posture at the edge of the scene. She stepped out, flanked by Matt, who stood with arms crossed. "What happened?" Thomas asked, his voice flat. Karen clutched a tablet in one hand, a file folder in the other. There was an emergency vote by the HOA board. Safety concerns, structural instability. We issued a demolition notice yesterday. You must not have seen it in time. Matt said nothing. Thomas stared at her. "I had no notice." Karen shrugged with something that looked like practiced sympathy. "We couldn't risk liability. And the structure was, well, you saw it. Outdated. Unstable. Behind them, a bulldozer idled, a streak of soot running down its side. The metal bucket was still stained with blackened wood. On the lawn, a new sign staked clean into the dirt, read, "Unsafe structure, removed per article, 7.3, HOA, oversight enacted." Deputy Holbrook arrived moments later, his cruiser kicking dust behind him. He stepped out, hat in hand, brows knit. "I just heard," he said quietly. "Didn't know they'd go that far." Thomas nodded once. "They did." Karen approached Holbrook. "Everything's documented," she said, tapping her tablet. "Minutes of the vote, structural concerns filed. We followed emergency protocol." Holbrook looked uncertain, but said nothing. Karen, satisfied, turned and walked back to her SUV. Thomas lingered. He walked the perimeter, memorizing the lines where his home had once stood. He didn't cry, didn't speak. He simply reached down and picked up a charred sliver of Ellen's old wind chime and slipped it into his pocket. That night, the cabin gone and the scent of smoke still lingering in his clothes, Thomas opened the back of his pickup. Beneath a false floorboard, he unlocked a small box and lifted it into the dim glow of his porch light. What little of the bulb still worked above his temporary trailer. Inside, a worn manila envelope of deed copies. A second envelope labeled Utility Disputes. Pine Valley, a sealed SD card. And at the bottom, thick and heavy, the Pine Valley Land Use Charter, signed and stamped in 1964. He sat in silence for hours, listening to the quiet rustle of pines beyond the gravel. The wind had changed. No longer sweet and free, it carried a charge, like something waiting. In the morning, with black coffee warming his palms, Thomas opened his laptop and inserted the SD card. The footage loaded slowly. The timestamp read 2:37 a.m. The screen filled with shadowy figures, Matt Delaney at the edge, pointing toward the cabin. Two workers approached with hard hats and headlamps. Engines roared to life. The bulldozer's treads rolled forward. Karen's voice, off-camera but unmistakable, drifted in from a distance. "Make sure it's quick. He won't fight back." Thomas sat still for a long moment, the screen casting pale light across his face. Then he reached for his phone, scrolled to a saved contact marked Langley-State AG. He pressed call. "It's Judge Whitaker. I need to open a case." As the morning sun cuts through the ruins of his cabin, Thomas kneels by an overturned rock and finds a small black box, one of his backup cameras still intact. The light filtered gently through pine boughs as Thomas stepped over the scattered remains of his porch. Embers no longer glowed, but the ground still smelled of soot and scorched earth. The broken ribs of the cabin cast long shadows. He moved slowly, methodically, like a man tracing the outline of a vanished life. He paused near the south fence, where Ellen had once planted columbine. A flat stone, dislodged during the demolition, now leaned on its side. Something caught the light beneath it. He crouched, brushed aside pine needles, and exhaled through his nose. A black box, scuffed but whole, his old trail camera, tucked there years ago to monitor deer paths, long forgotten. "Sometimes it's the quiet things that remember best," Ellen had once said, watching a bluebird nest beneath their gutter. He turned the camera in his hands. The plastic casing had survived the fire, the memory card likely protected. It wasn't much, but it was something. Later that day, Thomas sat inside his pickup, now doubling as both his office and home. The SD card from the camera loaded slowly on his laptop. The footage was grainy, shot in low light, but unmistakable. 3 figures, one of them clearly Matt Delaney, directing a machine operator under the cover of night. Karen's voice floated from off-screen, brisk and certain. "Once he's out, we can finish this place by fall. Pine Rise is ready." He paused the video. Rewound. Played again. That name, Pine Rise. He slipped the laptop into his case and drove down to the county records office. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed above neat rows of file cabinets. A young man behind the counter looked up, startled, then smiled when he recognized Thomas. "Judge Whitaker," he said. I didn't expect—" "Eli Sanderson," Thomas said. "You're still here." "Couldn't leave," Eli grinned sheepishly. "This place pays my tuition. What can I do for you?" Thomas lowered his voice. "I need your help pulling land use records, HOA filings, property transfer forms, anything tied to Pine Rise properties." Eli's expression shifted. "That company's been all over the archives lately. I thought it was strange. New filings keep popping up, and some backdated. Looked sloppy." Together they pored over maps, permits, signatures. Eli pulled a manila folder from the misfiled drawer. "This one caught my eye," he said, laying it flat. "Rezoning application for agricultural to mixed-use residential. Filed 2 weeks before your cabin was removed." Thomas scanned the paperwork. His name appeared on a consent form, signed in a hand that mimicked his, but missed the subtle curl he always added to his W. "Forgery," he said quietly. Eli's jaw tightened. "I thought so." They kept going. Another document showed falsified safety reports, dated the day before the demolition. A check stub from Pine Rise Properties made out to the HOA, labeled consulting fee. "Who owns Pine Rise?" Thomas asked. Eli typed a few strokes. "Matt Delaney's name doesn't appear, but his construction company dissolved last year. Then Pine Rise LLC was formed. Same mailing address." By sunset, Thomas sat in his truck again, a legal pad open on the passenger seat. He drafted a motion, not just to challenge the lien, but to begin a full inquiry into HOA malfeasance and potential land fraud. His fingers moved with practiced calm, even as his pulse thudded. He sent the packet, encrypted, to the state attorney's office. It was the first volley. Quiet, precise. The next day, as he stood outside the diner waiting for coffee, a courier approached and handed him a red-sealed envelope. Thomas opened it slowly. Notice: Emergency HEA vote. Subject property. Parcel 117. B proposal. Redevelopment for community utility space. Date: 48 hours from issuance. He read it twice, then folded it carefully and slipped it into his coat. The war had officially begun. A folding table, 4 chairs, and a pot of diner brewed coffee. Judge Whitaker hosts a secret porch meeting for neighbors who've also been targeted. The porch behind Earl's Diner wasn't much to look at, just weathered boards, mismatched chairs, and a folding table set with styrofoam cups and a steaming metal coffee pot. But tonight, under the dim, swaying lanterns and the heavy scent of pine and fried batter, it felt like the beating heart of Pine Valley. Thomas sat with his back to the wall, sleeves rolled up, the flash drive labeled Evidence Archive in one hand, and a new folder beside him, marked in neat pen, Testimonies. Mrs. Langston arrived first, walking slow, cane tapping on the wood with each careful step. "You know," she said, easing into the folding chair, "they told me my barn was a visual hazard, called it a structural risk and tore it down while I was at church." Earl came out from the kitchen, set a plate of lemon bars on the table, then nodded toward the back door. "Patels are coming. They brought pickled okra." Thomas offered a faint smile. "Good. I think we'll need all the flavor we can get." The Patel family arrived in a small pack, Mr. Patel holding a file folder, Mrs. Patel carrying a tray of jars, their teenage daughter trailing behind, clutching a photo of their garden beds. "We grew carrots for the senior center," she said quietly. "They said the trellis was unauthorized infrastructure." Thomas powered up his laptop. The screen glowed in the dusk. "I want to show you something," he said. This was recorded 3 weeks ago. He played the footage from his recovered trail camera. Karen's voice was clear, unmistakable. "Once he's out, we can finish this place by fall." "Pine Rise is ready." Gasps rose around the table. Mrs. Langston's knuckles went white around her cane. Mr. Patel shook his head slowly. "So it wasn't just us." "No," Thomas said. "It was never just one of us." He passed out copies of affidavits he'd prepared. "I need your stories, written, signed, submitted, together." There was silence for a moment, then the scrape of a pen across paper as Mrs. Langston began to write. More followed. Lantern light flickered on faces hardened not by anger, but by quiet resolve. Footsteps echoed from the alley beside the diner. Eli appeared, clutching a brown envelope, his hair mussed from the breeze. "I got it," he said. "You won't believe what was buried in the HOA's private minutes." He handed the envelope to Thomas, who pulled out a folded map and several typed pages. The map showed Pine Valley divided into neat parcels, many marked in red. In the lower corner, a note. Phase 3, Development, Luxury Townhomes, Q1 2024, subject to clearance of holdout properties. Thomas's finger landed on one name. Langston, Patel, Whitaker, all of us. A long silence settled. Mrs. Patel reached for her husband's hand. "They wanted us gone." "That's right," Thomas said, "and we still have 48 hours. Chairs creaked as neighbors leaned in. They discussed the emergency vote, who might attend, who could speak. Strategies formed, fears voiced, support offered. And then a new voice from the shadows. Deputy Holbrook stepped onto the porch, his hat in his hands. "I heard there was a meeting," he said. Earl gave him a cautious look. "You here to shut it down?" "No," Holbrook replied. "I'm here because I've seen the complaints, the citations. I didn't want to believe it. But if you've got proof, I'll stand with you. But we need to do this by the book." Thomas nodded. "We will." Holbrook lingered, then turned back toward the street. As the group began to disband, Earl stepped inside for a moment and returned with an old cardboard box. "Been meaning to give you this," he said, handing it to Thomas. "Found it when clearing out the diner attic. Belonged to my father. He was on the original zoning committee back in the 60s. Thomas opened it. Inside was a thick binder, yellowed and worn. The label read, Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. Original charter, unfiled. He stared at it, the weight of the past suddenly present. If the charter had never been filed with the county, every action the HOA had taken, every fine, every demolition, every lien, might be invalid. His hand gripped the binder. The wind stirred the pages. Karen opens the emergency HOA meeting with projected slides and a confident smile, unaware that half the town has shown up behind her. The Pine Valley Community Center buzzed with the low murmur of folding chairs, summer sandals scraping against linoleum, and the occasional cough. Ceiling fans spun overhead, pushing warm air through the open windows, and the scent of pine resin and evening sun drifted in from the surrounding forest. Karen Delaney stood at the podium, her white blazer crisp, her smile polished to perfection. Behind her, a projector displayed a blue-tinted slogan in clean sans serif font. Modernize together. She tapped the microphone. Good evening, neighbors. As chair of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, I want to thank you for attending tonight's special vote. We're here to discuss a proposed repurposing of Parcel 117B for community benefit. She flipped to the next slide. Proposal: multi-use recreational utility space. Only then did she notice the crowd, standing room only. Elderly couples in denim jackets, young families with toddlers, business owners in rolled-up sleeves. Faces she hadn't seen at meetings before. Faces that weren't smiling. Thomas Whitaker stood quietly near the back. Karen cleared her throat and continued. With recent events and safety concerns, especially the loss of a non-compliant structure, we believe converting that land into a public space will serve the greater good. She gestured toward the screen. The board recommends a unanimous vote. But before she could move to the ballot slide, a slow, deliberate sound echoed across the room, the swish of a judicial robe. Thomas stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not rush. I ask for the floor, he said. Karen's smile faltered. This is a procedural vote. The board— I said, he repeated, louder now, I ask for the floor. He reached the podium. The projector cast a faint halo behind his shoulders, flickering with the HOA's branding. Let the record reflect, Thomas said, turning to the crowd, that I speak as both a private citizen and as the presiding judicial authority of this district. He set a thick folder on the podium and opened it. This is Exhibit A, a copy of my original land deed, protected under zoning regulations dating back to 1964. He turned a page. Exhibit B, the unfiled HOA charter, rendering all enforcement actions null. Another page. Exhibit C, bank transfers from Pine Rise Properties to this HOA, filed as consulting services. Exhibit D, falsified safety reports and forged demolition consent forms, one of which bears a signature that is not mine. A hush fell over the room, deeper than silence. Exhibit E, he continued, is testimony from multiple residents, detailing harassment, forced compliance, and illegal destruction of personal property. Karen tried to speak, but the microphone had gone quiet. The projector flickered and went dark. Eli, seated in the front row, folded his laptop and met her gaze. Then, one by one, neighbors stood. Mrs. Langston spoke first. My barn didn't fall, it was pushed. Mr. Patel raised a paper. Our garden served the community. You tore it out for appearances. Even Deputy Holbrook stepped forward. I've watched. I stayed silent too long, but no more. From the back of the room, a figure rose, trim suit, badge clipped at the waist. The FBI agent did not speak. He simply nodded toward two officers near the side door. Karen's breath caught as they approached. Matt Delaney stiffened, then rose, as if to protest, but said nothing when the agent laid a hand on his shoulder. They were escorted out quietly. No shouting, no cuffs, just the weight of evidence moving like tide. When the door closed behind them, Thomas turned back to the crowd. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small wooden gavel, splintered at the base. The same one Karen had used during the last vote before bulldozing his home. "You forgot something, Mrs. Delaney. Justice." And with one sharp motion, he struck the podium. Meeting adjourned. The sound echoed like thunder in the quiet room. There was no applause at first, just the rustling of relief. Then hands met palms, gently at first, then firmer, building into something steady and unshakable. Weeks later, a rebuilt wind chime sways beside a reconstructed cabin as Thomas reads a letter. "You are hereby awarded the Pine Valley Legacy Stewardship Award." As the wind chime swayed beside the rebuilt cabin, the town of Pine Valley felt quieter, not with silence, but with peace. What began as one man's quiet defiance became a chorus of neighbors rediscovering their strength in unity. Justice, it turns out, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it arrives in the steady voice of truth and the soft creak of a porch swing returning home. Like a good harvest, fairness takes time. But when it comes, it nourishes more than just the land. And in towns like this, where roots run deep, that kind of justice grows back stronger every